us. Dr. Faggioli is an assistant professor at the University of St. Thomas in the Twin Cities, but he comes to us not only from the Twin Cities, but before that, managing to have a rather distinguished academic career at the University of Modena, Reggio Emilia, the University of Bolzano, the University of Bologna, and perhaps most interestingly for the topic of our conference today, for almost a decade, he was a researcher and member of the research staff at the John the 23rd Foundation for Religious Studies in Bologna. And I had the pleasure with John O'Keefe this morning of podcasting Dr. Faggioli and heard about his interest and his deep scholarship in Vatican II and John the 23rd from the very beginning of his career, really. So we're very pleased to have him. Among his many books and articles, both authored and co-authored and edited, are, and I'm going to give you the English titles, many of them are in Italian, The Bishop and the Council, Episcopal Model and Aggiornamento at Vatican II, Brief History of the Catholic Movements, and an edited book, Taking Care, The Private Journals of Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli in Bulgaria, 1925 to 1934. I know you will enjoy Dr. Faggioli and his wonderful, insightful, and as we discovered this morning, rather wonderfully surprising perspectives on the Second Vatican Council. He's going to talk to us about the reforms of the liturgy in the Council and the common good. Please welcome Dr. Faggioli.
Good afternoon. Thank you for being here, and thank you to the organizers. It's always a bit awkward for me to speak on a Jesuit campus because, as you probably know, the University of St. Thomas was founded in 1885 by Bishop John Ireland to keep Jesuits out of the upper Midwest. So my academic career in the US started with one-year fellowship at Boston College, which is where I met John Baldwin, and I want to thank him here publicly for the support for my book and for many other things. So it's a real pleasure to be here. The liturgical reform and the common good. What happened in these last few years in the Church told us very clearly that the meaning of the liturgical reform for Vatican II and for modern Catholicism goes well beyond the technical review of the liturgical books and rituals. In a way, it is fair to say that the challenges moved against the liturgical reform in these last few years forced Catholic theologians to rediscover the key role of the liturgical constitution in the history and theology of the Second Vatican Council and for the history of post-Vatican II Catholicism. The liturgical unity of the Church in these last few years has been damaged, but we have now, as a Church, a clearer sense of the importance of the liturgical reform for the Catholicity of the Church. The liturgical reform of Vatican II is indeed one of the most important, if not, in my opinion, the most important reform in the history of modern Catholicism, and we are now, 50 years after Vatican II, at the beginning of the rediscovery of the theological meaning of this reform and of its potential for the future of the Church. For Catholics who still had doubts about that, Pope Francis, in his interview with the Jesuit magazines published by America on September the 19th, made very clear how he sees the liturgical reform, and I quote, "Vatican II produced a renewal movement that simply comes from the same gospel. Its fruits are enormous. Just recall the liturgy. The work of liturgical reform has been a service to the people as a rereading of the gospel from a concrete historical situation," end quote. In light of this changed situation in this extraordinary year 2013 for the Catholic Church, it is appropriate to focus once again on the liturgical reform, but with a less defensive approach and a more future-oriented view. And the focus of this lecture is the relationship between the liturgical reform of Vatican II, its core theological ideas, and the idea of the common good in the contemporary Catholic Church. In order to do this, I will address first the relationship between Vatican II and the liturgical reform. Second, the political culture expressed by Vatican II concerning the idea of common good. And last, the connections between the ecclesiology of the liturgical reform and the idea of common good. First, theologians and historians have somehow taken for granted for a long time a few elements of the liturgical reform. The long history of the liturgical movement before Vatican II, the fact that Vatican II was the first council in church history to approve a doctrinal document on the liturgy. Third, the undeniable truth that something happened for liturgy at Vatican II. Fourth, the interconnections between the liturgical reform and the ecclesiological issue at the council. And fifth, the patent fact that the liturgical reform of Vatican II is the last vast reform within the post-Tridentine Catholic Church after the reform of church discipline between the 16th and the 17th centuries. Both historians and theologians have been inclined for a long time to forget the tight associations between the liturgical debate at Vatican II, the reform of the liturgy, the striving for the aggiornamento, and the updating and reform in general of the Catholic Church. But most of all, in some interpretations of the documents of Vatican II, the fact that Vatican II has a deep internal coherence, as John O'Malley has stressed, seemed to be sometimes lost. The sometimes self-referential debate about Vatican II sidestepped and obscured the profound significance of Sacrosanctum Concilium. The interconnections between liturgy and Vatican II, understood not as a collection of documents, but as a coherent reality of the Catholic Church, must emerge if we want to understand the impact of the Council on global Catholicism. It is therefore clear that the reception of the liturgical reform is an eminently important test for the reception of Vatican II, and especially of its ecclesiology. The reception of Sacrosanctum Concilium is a reception of the ecclesiology of the liturgical constitution and of its consequences. Vice versa, the rejection of Sacrosanctum Concilium is a rejection of the liturgical constitution and especially of its ecclesiological consequences. Regarding this, the case of the Lefebvrites is particularly significant. The SSPX has always looked, I would say correctly, at the liturgical reform not as a problem as such, but as the gateway for Vatican II and for all the discontinuities that the ultra-traditionalist schismatic community has always rejected, especially the view of the Church, and in particular, the Church and ecumenism, the Church and the Jews, and interreligious dialogue. Now, it's clear to everyone that dividing the Church into conservatives and liberals is a non-scholarly way of understanding the ecclesial situation. These labels come from the tradition of political language, and they have lost some of their meaning even in politics. But there is no doubt that the divisions around the liturgical reform, as divisions based in ecclesiology, derive from different cultures in the Catholic Church that have to do also with the political views, broadly speaking, of some Catholic groups. The liturgical reform addresses issues in the life of the Church that have an institutional and political element, like the issue of centralization and decentralization of and in the Church, the role of the clergy and of the hierarchy, the role of cultures in worship and in theology, the relationship between the church and the world, and an idea of history and its relationship with theology. Now, about Vatican II and the common good, we must remember that Vatican II, both in its documents and in the event, is the expression of a set of ideas and cultures of Catholicism in a given moment in church history. As we know, Vatican II did not send a politically partisan message. It would also have been impossible in a church assembly of 2,500 bishops from the 5 continents. Nevertheless, there are ideas that are typical of the culture of Vatican II and that say something about the view of that ecumenical council on the world, on society, and on the role of politics. On the horizon of our global world, the Second Vatican Council has made of the Church a global citizen with a different perception of the world and of modernity. Vatican II is something like a guarantee of citizenship for the Catholic Church in today's global world. This guarantee has been identified in public opinion with the definitive rejection of anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism as elements of a pre-modern and anti-democratic political culture, and with other specific elements in the way the Council broke with the Catholic Church of the long 19th century, as John O'Malley called it. It is no coincidence that these core elements of the political culture and of the political reception of the Council are exactly the ones rejected by the Lefebvrites, and not only by them, as the heresies of the Council, a council whose gateway is the liturgical reform. The Second Vatican Council took place after World War II. The discontinuities of the Council in the relationship of the Church to democratic culture, in the appreciation of modern liberties rejected by Pope Pius IX syllabus of 1864, in collegiality and co-responsibility in the Church, in the commitment to ecumenism and to interreligious dialogue, and so forth, all these ideas, they have had a political impact. At the same time, they underscore the fact that there is a constitutional core within Vatican II. It is evident that the epoch-making changes wrought by Vatican II have had an impact far beyond the inner life of the Church itself. They established the Church as a community in the modern world where the Church is recognized also as a political cultural agent. And that is considered an important part of the identity of the Church. These changes in the position of the Church in the global world have a lot to do with the Catholic understanding of the common good. For a long time, especially during the long 19th century, between the French Revolution, basically, and World War II, Catholic magisterium and theology saw only the Catholic Church as able to define, superintend, and direct the common good. This claim was substantiated with a direct accusation of politics as the illegitimate successor of the Church in taking care of the common good. This is the history of the relationship between Catholic magisterium and the political issue until the mid-20th century in the vast world outside the United States of America. After the shock of the revolutions of the late 18th and mid-19th century, politics was seen as the fruit of this separation of the modern world from the moral guidance of the only true Church. Catholic politicians were allowed to entertain commerce with the modern world only de facto, as a practical necessity, because sometimes for the hierarchy it was too embarrassing to be involved directly with the political realm, when they did not acknowledge its legitimacy. Only during Vatican II do we see this this scenario changed with the acknowledgement that modernity exists and that Catholics live in the church, but they also live in society and in a political community that had in recent times become democratic, one of the many signs of the times that the church had to confront. Vatican II was inspired by a fundamental call to unity in the church, ecumenical and interreligious unity, and the fathers and the theologians of Vatican II saw in modernity a moment of advancement towards unity, and the church as one of the agents of the promotion of this unity, as we can read in Gaudium et Spes, especially number 42. One of the most forgotten elements of the importance of Vatican II, especially in this zeitgeist at the beginning of the 21st century, or one of the elements sometimes taken for granted, is that the Catholic Church elaborated at Vatican II a set of principles that Catholics must represent in the public arena and in a democratic public arena that can be called a social democracy, a democracy whose goal is not procedural but must be measured in its ability to meet the demands of a human dignity that the Church proclaims as closely connected to the social nature of the human person. Vatican II's view on the Catholic understanding of the relationship between the individual human person and the social political dimension, that is what we can call the political culture of Vatican II, not only draws on the recent experience of the Christian democratic parties in post-World War II Europe, but also and especially on the social doctrine of the Church. But this tradition of the social doctrine of the Church was a changing tradition. This becomes clear if we remember that the social and political message of Vatican II to the world is contained chronologically between the first and the last documents published by Vatican II on behalf of the Church. First, the opening speech of John the 23rd Gaudet Mater Ecclesia, and a few days later, the message to the world of October 1962, spoke of the two urgent issues facing the world to which the Church was particularly attentive, that is, peace and social justice. On the other hand, at the end of the Council, the Pastoral Constitution Gaudium et Spes employs the expression common good 30 times, and of these, 18 times in chapter 4 on the life of the political community and chapter 5 on the community of nations. Now, an analysis of the roots of the idea of social justice and of common good in the documents of the Second Vatican Council would require another paper or a very long book. But what is clear, and some scholars have reproached the Council about this, is that in the documents of Vatican II, there is no direct and explicit connection between the liturgical reform and the social message of the Council, specifically between the first document of Vatican II, Sacrosanctum Concilium, and the last document, Gaudium et Spes, or the document on religious freedom. In my book, True Reform, I focused on the reception as well on the lack of the reception of the liturgical constitution by the rest of Vatican II, by the other documents. And this is clearly one of the limitations of the Council, which has to do with the periodization of the Council being the Vatican II of 1963, quite different from the Vatican II of 1965, of Gaudium et Spes. But the silence of the Council on the connection between liturgy and Catholic social doctrine is perhaps, this is my hypothesis, due not only to a lack of understanding of the issue, but also to the awareness of the problematic and sometimes controversial nature of the relationship between the liturgical movement before Vatican II and the social and the political culture of the Church before Vatican II. The history of the liturgical movement in the 19th century and the early 20th century sometimes showed the features of a Catholicism aiming at the rebuilding of a Catholic society shaped by intransigent and anti-modern and anti-democratic social and political cultures. In other words, at Vatican II, some of the elements of the liturgical movement of the pre-Vatican II era, in Europe especially, but not only, these elements had become impossible to use because, for example, in the 1930s in Germany, the liturgical movement, many members of the liturgical movement had become part of the call for a renewed national community, Volksgemeinschaft, that also spoke powerfully to Catholics and that became part of the appeal of many Catholics in favor of Nazism. Since Vatican II, many Catholics, especially in the US, but not only, they have been accustomed to think of reform of the liturgical reform as signifying a renewed awareness of the social dimensions of the faith, and to assume that this new awareness will naturally have progressive political consequences. That is not necessarily the case. Abbot Hildefonse Erwegen at Maria Laach was a patron of reactionary Catholicism as well of the liturgical movement. In his welcoming address to the attendees at a special conference of the Catholic Scholars Association convened at Maria Laach, day after the signing of the Concordat between Hitler and the Vatican in 1933, Abbot Erwegen delivered this oft-quoted statement, and I quote, "In the religious sphere, for the past 20 years, it has been the so-called liturgical movement that acted as a counterweight against an ever more unrestrained and lunatic individualism. Now, in the political sphere, it is fascism," end quote. That is to say that there was a direct parallel in many milieux between the pre-World War II liturgical movement in Europe and fascist political culture, since one of the central goals of the liturgical movement was a restored communal and corporate sense of the Church as the body of Christ. For the liturgical movement, which was already almost a generation old in Germany in the 1930s, this meant a special relationship with the Nazi regime. This is a very particular case, so we cannot generalize to the whole of the liturgical movement, but that is to say two things. First, that the relationship between the liturgical movement and political cultures is far from simple and sometimes still obfuscated by incorrect assumptions about the obvious and natural progressive or liberal character of some theological ideas. And second, that the liturgical movement at Vatican II becomes something different than the one of the previous generations because this liturgical movement at Vatican II gets in touch with Vatican II as ideas expressed in documents, but also in the event of the Second Vatican Council. And it comes after World War II and the new awareness of the limitations and of the consequences of a Catholic social doctrine still focused on Pius XI's idea of the social reign of Christ. In other words, it seems to me that if we want to understand the social message of the liturgical reform on the common good, we must pay attention to the differences between the different periods of the liturgical movement in the 20th century, and especially to the differences between the liturgical movement before and after Vatican II. In the liturgical constitution of Vatican II, there are elements that come from the pre-Vatican II and the pre-World War II ideas of the liturgical movement. Among others, Sacrosanctum Concilium is aware of the public and political character of the liturgy, which stated in the introduction that the Church is, I quote, a sign lifted up among the nations. If the Constitution does not mention the Council's political culture, however, it builds a discourse on the Eucharist to the Church that lives on earth. But there are also elements that come from the theology of Vatican II and of the other theological movements, and that permeated the ideas and the basis of the liturgical reform of the Second Vatican Council. The relationship between revelation, tradition, history, and the idea of the Church as a communion in the path of ecumenical union with other churches and the human community has a political meaning because it starts from an acceptance of the basic ideas of the theological movements that are fed into Vatican II and accepts the fact of history as a theological element in the idea of liturgy as source and summit of the Church. That is to say that Vatican II had a political culture, a view of the modern world that was expressed by many documents ad extra. Vatican II has a political culture that is expressed by many documents ad extra on ecumenism, on religious freedom, interreligious dialogue. But ultimately, this political culture and its connection to the longing for rapprochement was expressed also by the documents ad intra on the Church, on the Revelation, but first and foremost by the Constitution on the liturgy. The liturgical reform of Vatican II is based on certain theological and cultural insight that are substantiated in the movement towards a reform of the Church in the ecumenical sense of rapprochement, made possible by a conversion to the sources of the Church and its theological and spiritual reflection of the early theologians. The beginning of the liturgical constitution marks, in fact, the pragmatic of Vatican II, not through a theoretical description of liturgy, but through a narrative of the relationship between God and his people that tastes distinctly Catholic as universal and offers Christ and the Eucharist as the center of gravity in a clear ressourcement to the patristic idea of the Eucharist as sacramentum unitatis. What I want to say is that the major difference between the pre-Vatican II liturgical movement and the liturgical movement at Vatican II and the liturgical constitution is marked by this difference that at Vatican II, the liturgical issue is embedded in a deep ecumenical idea and in a fundamental idea of solidarity with the world and with history. Therefore, the liturgical reform and the council are inextricably linked because all the major theological ferments of Vatican II have left traces in the liturgical constitution, the rediscovery of the Word of God, ecclesiology, ecumenism, relations with the Jews, the Church, and the modern world. The liturgical movement was able, together with the pre-conciliar renewal of pastoral theology, to bring to the council the need to develop new instruments that could show the bonds of earthly realities with the liturgical prayer. The forms of the liturgical celebration are not indifferent to the world in which the contemporary church lives, as shown by the reactions to the schism of Lefebvre, SSPX, who refused to recognize Vatican II. It is evident, even for observers apparently more distant from the church, such as non-Catholic churches, Jewish communities, political observers, and public intellectuals, that there is a link between the forms of the liturgy, the theological culture of the church, and the worldview of the church. The theological content of the liturgical constitution has intertextual connections with all the other documents of the Council that are crucial for the overall theological balance of the Council. Almost 30 years ago, the late Kevin Sisselt wrote about the connection between liturgy, justice, and common good, and I quote, "Any work for the unity of the Church that overlooks the need of the world is not in the tradition of Jesus. The Eucharist is meant to mediate the unity of the Church and the unity of mankind. It builds up the Church, but it also gives the Church a missionary task, which includes ethical responsibility of taking liberating actions for justice in the world. The Eucharist roots us in the life of Jesus. It also thrusts us into the future where we will be one, not only with Him, but also with each other." End quote. What I want to say is that the political culture of Catholics, grounded in Vatican II, must rediscover this element. Knowing, though, that the very idea of reform in theology and in the Catholic Church, especially when it deals with social and political issues, so the idea of reform can be a very elusive idea. It is true that the connection between the liturgical reform of Vatican II and the ideas of the Council on the common good, society, and politics are an unexplored, from an historical perspective, especially unexplored field of study, as well as maybe the study of the particular differences between the pre-World War II liturgical movement and the liturgical movement at Vatican II in Europe. Nevertheless, it seems clear to me that the liturgical reform of Vatican II, for how it came about in the debates and in the context of the other documents of the Council, has a distinctive idea of the common good that derives from the renewed ideas of the relationship between the Church and the world, the Church in the modern world, as Gaudium et Spes says, which is a very distinctive ecclesiological idea. It is an idea of the common good that is different from the dream of restoring a communal and corporate sense of the Church as the body of Christ that was typical of the pre-Vatican II era. The liturgical reform is part of a church that is described not anymore by Mystici Corporis of 1943, and not only by Lumen Gentium alone, but also by Gaudium et Spes, and by the whole context of Vatican II as the first council of a really global Catholic Church. This means that there is a connection between the reception of the liturgical reform and the social and political culture and the idea of common good expressed by Vatican II in its documents. And the spectrum of the oppositions to Vatican II, the schismatic oppositions and the non-schismatic oppositions to Vatican II, are a clear evidence of that. However, we need to take a step further in understanding the relationship between Vatican II, the liturgical reform, and the common good, and it seems to me that in some cases, the rejection of the common good is part of a larger non-reception of Vatican II. And that's very evident for the case of the Lefebvrites. But in other cases, the rejection of the idea of a common good is leading some quarters of Catholic theology to a quiet and unstated rejection of the social and political message of Vatican II ad extra. This phenomenon is one of the critical points, in my opinion, for the survival of Vatican II in American Catholicism, that is, in a culture that has witnessed many elements, and among them, the rise of a very privatized and libertarian culture that is totally indifferent to the idea of a common good. Second, the growing marginalization of larger portions of the population from the political process. And third, the big sort, the clustering of like-minded people in American society as well as in American Catholicism. It is indeed very necessary to recall the origins of the liturgical movement in the US and the fact that the early advocates of the liturgical renewal in the 1920s and 30s were also strong advocates of the connection between liturgy and social justice. But we must also be aware of the differences between the pre-World War II liturgical movement and the liturgical movement at Vatican II. The criticism against the liturgical constitution's silence about social justice can also be unfair, I think, because Sacrosanctum Concilium must be read in the context of the other documents of the Second Vatican Council and of what Vatican II was. For example, the message to the world of October 1962, even more, the so-called Catacomb Pact for a poor church made by 40 bishops on November the 16th, 1965, in the Santa Domitilla Catacomb. My conclusion. From a theological point of view, it is today very difficult and impervious to utilize as such the pre-Vatican II liturgical movement's idea on society, because the whole ecclesiological context of Vatican II is lacking. And that gives the idea of the liturgy and its social culture a completely different taste. We must restore the link between liturgical reform and social justice, but this is viable only in the context of Vatican II. In absentia of Vatican II, without Vatican II, we have two options, I think. One option is a restoration, a pre-Vatican II view of the link between liturgical reform and social justice that is a more communitarian and radical view of Catholicism, the one embodied, for example, by Dorothy Day and by other radical social movements within the Church. Another option, which I think is more in line with the intention and the mind of the bishops and theologians of Vatican II, is reading the liturgical reform and its social message in a context of a public Catholicism that does not advocate for a flight from the established form of presence of the Church and of Catholics in the social and political debate. In a way, Catholic theology today, especially in the US, we are still facing the alternative between so-called sacramental radicals on one side, inclined to create an alternative culture and a strategy of separation, and on the other side, an idea of Catholic social action or the social ideas of the so-called New Deal Catholics. This issue is at the heart of the future of the public face of Catholicism, with enormous repercussions for the very essence of Catholicism. In my opinion, the recent liturgy wars are just one part and one manifestation of this dilemma. Thank you.
Faute de mieux. Fascinating and very sophisticated analysis. Thank you very much. I wonder what you would make of some of the elements, though. I don't know. I want to suggest a nuance, perhaps, because some of the elements of the pre-Vatican II liturgical movement, like I'm thinking of Lambert Baudouin, Montcésar, ecumenism, Virgil Michael in Minnesota, don't seem to fall on either side exactly of those two alternatives you just gave.
I agree completely. So I was just using this example of the liturgical movement in Germany, and I could have given also examples for the liturgical movement in Italy that see in the 1920s, 30s, their antagonist in a democratic culture that was, in their view, destroying the old way of being Catholic, of the old lifestyle, the old communal. Now, if we talk about Lambert Baudouin, it's a completely different case. So I'm very grateful for this opportunity here, because this is one idea that I developed in these last couple of years. I mean, thinking, sometimes your best idea comes after your book has been published. And so this is not probably the best idea that I have, but it's something new. It's something new that comes from my experience of, coming from different Catholic backgrounds. Having studied in Italy, in Germany, working in the US. So here we need much more nuance. I've become convinced that first we should be less romantic about thinking about the liturgical movement as one thing, that there's a perfect continuity between. And second, my very last page, that this dilemma of today between Catholics who think that it's not worth to fight for a public face of Catholicism, but it's only time to regroup. I think that this is a very interesting challenge, because it's very difficult to label them as conservatives or liberals. But this is, I think, a key issue for the survival of the Second Vatican Council, because it's a church that is exactly the opposite of a closed-gate church. It's exactly the opposite. And in my experience, I see that sometimes the liturgical unease of some communities is part of this idea, let's give up on being public Catholic, and let's recreate our ideal perfect community, which are never perfect, of course, but this is the dream. I think that this is a contradiction of the Second Vatican Council. And it might lead to very severe consequences, because Vatican II, as you know very well, it's one thing. If you take out one brick, other bricks will follow. And then if you dream of recreating a perfect, very intense community, and to withdraw from the public, next brick is your ecumenical engagement. Next brick is... so this is how Catholicism works, especially Vatican II. So I'm very concerned about that personally.
Just to follow on that, Massimo, I was struck by not only the problematic of what is between the movement, the liturgical movement before the council and after, but the development of thinking within the council itself because of experience, the experience of the Spirit, if you will, the experience of the lived reality of church in multiple parts of the world by people who'd never dreamed of those issues. And then subsequently we've experienced all kinds of dimensions of how to be church that are new in some ways in our world. And so I think for example, the rise of movements like the neo-catechumenate is an example of what you're talking about, this kind of closing oneself off or coming into a kind of tight, structured community that sort of is an ideal Catholic community that everyone, really practices. I have a mental image of Calvinism in Switzerland in the 16th century. But I wonder if the very thing that Pope Francis is doing in talking about the messiness of the street, the messiness of the road, that Catholicism has to be out in the middle of the street, or it has to be out on the road functioning, and of course it's going to be messy. I mean, his implication is some of us are going to get run over. So I mean, I just have that sense that that's what he's trying to kind of fight as well, this kind of closing in on a perfect Catholicism, because we've imbibed all this scripture, we've imbibed all this liturgy and so on, and so we now are super Catholics. We're sort of superior to those sort of potential Catholics out there, or less Catholics, because they're not going to Mass as often as we are, and so on and so on.
Yeah. That question number 2 or 3, Pope Francis always comes up now. So whatever you talk, but that is a very important question. Why? Because also for the liturgical issue, but for many other issues, in my judgment of church historian, Pope Francis has really inaugurated the beginning of the post-Vatican II. So he's the first post-Vatican II Pope. He became a priest in 1969, while Pope Benedict was ordained priest in 1951. So they belong to two completely different ages. What he's doing is this idea of an open church. Open church doesn't mean that anything goes, but open because open is not an optional choice. It's part of being church. So what is very good at, I think, is that he's doing Vatican II without ever mentioning Vatican II, which is exactly what I would do. Because in these last 10 years, I mean, Vatican II had become a theological football, continuity, discontinuity, rupture, all these crazy things. So he knows that he has to do Vatican II without entering into the minefield of the hermeneutic. He's doing Vatican II, and people know that. Vatican II has been accused of being hyper-sophisticated. But when you see Vatican II, you get it. And this is what he is doing, I think. It's one of the most fascinating. So for him, Vatican II is part of his life. It's like pasta for me. I mean, I don't have to explain why it's important. I mean, it's in my DNA. That's Vatican II for him.
So if I understand you right, so somebody like Dorothy Day then, and let's say you take Catholic worker and the people who are kind of looking for liturgical purity as a way to fix everything, they're kind of cut from the same cloth? I mean, is that sort of your thesis in some ways?
No, it's not my thesis. I'm saying
or
that
one of the points, anyway.
they embody two different political cultures of Catholicism. First, And as you know, Dorothy Day went to the Vatican during Vatican II. But she's not a Vatican II Catholic. She's Dorothy Day. I mean, it's a completely other thing. So I'm not judging her being a good Catholic or not. In my judgment, intellectually, they are legitimate expressions of political cultures that are perfectly fine if they do not become the official guideline of the church. So I strongly believe that we need more Dorothy Days. But I'm afraid, to be very blunt, of bishops that when they talk about politics, they think they are Dorothy Day. Which you can be Dorothy Day if you go in jail, if you pay personally for that kind of thing. And that is is necessary, not perfectly fine, is necessary. But I think that Catholicism as a system works also with another kind of political social culture. We cannot afford to be as radical as Dorothy Day needed to be. Okay, so I'm not saying that I'm against Dorothy Day, or I just think that they are very particular expressions, and that there are liturgical elements that we should see as part of that Catholic ethos. I come from European Catholicism, where we never had, figures like Dorothy Day. It's a very established Catholicism. The German church gets 5 billion euros from taxpayers every year, still. And Italy is not very far from. So what I'm saying, and here it gets sometimes uncomfortable for one like me who's still on a green card. What I want to say is that even in American Catholicism that is unestablished or very differently established, there is a very established element that is needed. And my job, when I talk to my students, bishop, if I had this opportunity, I would say to them, don't think of the Catholic Church as sustainable with the same theological and political ideas of the Puritans of the 16th century. Nobody believes you historically. That it's non-credible, and it's not sustainable. So this is it's a discourse that goes beyond the liturgy, but I think that sometimes I have seen very socially committed Catholics who refuse the liturgy of the Second Vatican Council, not because they hate the new missal, but they are convinced that the political culture of the Second Vatican Council is a failure or was a mistake, and their way to express their refusal is to start with the liturgy. That's one thing that is pastorally very complicated, but that's part of it. And in this, there's no motu proprio that can heal this wound. Either in one direction or the other. It must be, in my view, a cultural theological discourse with American Catholics and between American Catholics that is historically more grounded, less romantic. We have always been in favor of religious freedom. That's not true. That's true after 1965. Before, let's not talk about that. Okay, so less romantic, and I think that there are problems that are very connected between the liturgical problems that we have and the cultural political issues that are part of our of our church in this country. More visibly here, because it's a very vibrant country. I mean, it's more visible here.
No, I was just going to have a quick question to follow up on him, and then you, Dennis. You speak of the liturgy being the place where those who would, I don't know, retreat to a more insular, perfected idea of Catholicism. Often in those circles I hear the language of, well, we miss the beauty, we miss the mystery of the faith. And there's a kind of a retrojection of the idea that, not only a romantic idea, but a return to something that's mysterious and beautiful. How does that fit in, and what do you have to say to that?
So I get that a lot from some of my students, and they tell me, well, this lost sense of mystery. And I tell them, one thing is mystery, and the other thing is being obscure. So there are two different things. That is part of what we have heard from Rome in these last few years, that Latin is more original, is more Catholic. So this has done huge damage. I'm being very honest here. That has done huge damage, especially with the young people. I always tell them, in high school, I got 5 years of Latin and 5 years of Greek. So I have no problem with that. But when I say the Padre Nostro, our Father, with my daughter, I don't say that in Latin. It is imposing your wounds on somebody else. So this is what happened in these last 10 years. So the cultural wounds suffered by somebody in the hierarchy have been deflected on the body of the church. That is one of the most outrageous things. So there are very beautiful modern liturgies and very ugly Latin liturgies. There's no question about that. But if we idealize, we can idealize anything, everything. So in this sense, I think that this risk of regrouping, of retrenching, is dangerous because it feeds a mentality of a nostalgia for a world that never existed. I tell my students, even if you hate Vatican II, you don't want to go back to the 1950s. Believe me, you don't want to go back. And I've never lived in the 1950s, but it doesn't, I mean, only Hollywood can make you think that it's good to go back. But so that is a huge problem. I think that one of our problems, I mean, on my campus, for example, is that this kind of discourse can be done, and that is a segue to what Eileen was saying this morning, is that this kind of message can be given to students only in an experiential way, and not always in a classroom. But whenever you bring up this thing with faculty members, colleagues, that raises enormous issues, because are we going to be evaluated on our spirituality? It's a very complicated thing.
I found your description of those alternatives that you mentioned at the end very stimulating. It forces me to think about this. But when I think about it, what comes to my mind is we've gone through so many fashions within my own lifetime of Roman Catholics establishing their place and becoming acceptable by the larger culture and proving that we can be good Catholics and good Americans and so on, to a place where we realize we have an identity that's different from the culture, and in some ways we are to be countercultural. And then, of course, there are the extremes of people who idealize being countercultural and, sort of backing off and almost becoming Amish in a Catholic way. And the good guy, John Courtney Murray, is becoming a bad guy who's compromising too much with the making sense to the public in the public forum. But what I'm left with is the realization, it seems to me, that contemplating these extremes forces us to realize that we live a life calling for more constant discernment over and over again in what situation I am called to be countercultural and in what situation I am to embrace the good things of our culture. I mean, isn't that really what it comes down to? It's not so much choosing one or other of those possible extremes, but saying, boy, we can't just become a Catholic culture because you can't live that way anymore. We have to follow Jesus in a life of discernment that's constantly saying, to what extent do I affirm the culture? To what extent do I resist it?
Yeah. So this is for me as a scholar and as a new American Catholic, it's the most fascinating thing, because if you say to an Italian Catholic, you should be more countercultural, he looks at you and says, well, what that means. I mean, this is a real issue. So usually, Vatican II has been accused to be too much, cultural and too little countercultural. What I think that is necessary that we retrieve from Vatican II is that we need to be countercultural, but that makes sense if you live in the city with other people. It's not isolated, first. And second, Christianity as such exists always in a cultural context. So often, this being countercultural has been used as an alibi. Well, we don't share the culture. Well, actually, if we go through your, for example, tax return, you will see that you share a lot of this culture, and many other things. Okay, so it's a very delicate balance. Usually, anti-Vatican II Catholics have said Vatican II is too liberal, too cultural, so we are the real countercultural. I don't think that's true. So it's a very, very fine line. Every Catholic needs to be cultural and countercultural. Every Catholic has his her own balance. I give you my example. As a teacher on a Catholic campus, to have my message effective, I cannot afford to be too countercultural, because I would become a joke. So it's a matter of style and of strategy also. But again, this is the most typical issue for American Catholicism, and this is what I think in the future American Catholicism should teach other Catholics around the world, that take this issue as simple or as solved by their concordat or by the idea that they are minority. It's always very subtle, and it is especially in this country where Catholics were a minority that there is a much deeper experience about that.
Thank you for the presentation, and especially for some of the connections you make that I don't think we always make in the preconciliar period. One of your former colleagues at St. Thomas, William Kavanaugh, wrote a book in the late 90s called Torture and Eucharist. And he argues that in the Chilean context and the Pinochet, that in a sense, the church became so concerned with the broader culture and the state that he talks about the disappearance of the church, and basically Pinochet was able just to go forward because there was such a culture of, well, this is our political leader, this is not our place to do this, and that even transcended in some ways some ideological lines. So he proposes a vision of a kind of Eucharistic politics that could counter the disappearance of the church in the modern world. I could see how the direction you're taking would reject that as a kind of sectarian temptation. I guess my question is that true? Do you think there isn't any kind of place for that sort of Eucharistic politics? And then second, if you could just flesh out a little more what this Vatican II politics actually is, what it actually looks like,
Yeah.
and
So,
that would be helpful.
Bill Kavanaugh is a very good friend and is a very, very good theologian. I have publicly criticized his proposal of a sectarian Catholicism because I think that is intellectually fascinating. It is practically very difficult to do, and I would say dangerous. It could be an illusion. So, and he's one with Michael Baxter that have recently said that John Courtney Murray was foolish. He was naive. So this is a real debate. So your second question is this. So there are many things that we could say about the political culture of the council. I could say, 1,000 things. One thing is that at Vatican II, the church sees itself as in the modern world, as walking in history and not judging above. There is a deep solidarity with the world, and they are the main theological ideas. The practical consequences are that in the documents of the Second Vatican Council invite Catholics to be active in politics, to be active in civil life, in society. That was new. That is new. Because Vatican II assumes that Catholics will not be always running the place. So in Vatican II, we have the clear conscience that Vatican II will have to work with non-Catholics. Before Vatican II, it was perfectly fine for Catholics to be in power as long as they took order from the Pope. That was fine. That was perfect. But at Vatican II, that doesn't work anymore. So after Pacem in Terris and then Gaudium et Spes, you have the acknowledgement that the modern world has become a world of charter of individual rights, of constitutions, of separation of power. That is new. And that is an acceptance of some elements of modern political culture. And there is an invitation of Catholics to be responsible in that. So it's not an acknowledgement that says, well, unfortunately, we have become democratic. No, it says, fortunately, we have become democratic. It's much better than being under Hitler, which was a huge shadow on Vatican II, on many German bishops. But it was, so there are elements that we can see are part of that political culture. Now, fortunately, Vatican II doesn't say a perfect state should have a constitution, one chamber. It doesn't say that. But there are elements inviting Catholics of being part of this new world. I see that a retrenchment, so if they want to make this case about that, they should at least say, well, we are going to rediscuss that thing of the Second Vatican Council, which we no longer consider valid. But they don't do that because they know that taking out one element from Vatican II is a corrosive action that will corrode many other things. So, this book on the political culture of the Second Vatican Council is my dream. I was And then other things happen, and then Pope Francis has completely revolutionized my agenda. So, but that is one real issue. So there are things that in the Catholic Church before Vatican II they were bad things, and after Vatican II they are good things. And this is one of the many discontinuities of the Council. There's no way to say, well, nothing changed. I mean, a lot of things changed. I mean, ask John Kennedy or American Catholics. I mean, it changed a lot of things. So I'm not saying that that is the most important element of the Second Vatican Council. I think that there are Dei Verbum. I mean, the theological ideas are the most important elements. Okay. But for our situation of a very polarized church with a deep skepticism about politics, deep skepticism about government, I think that Catholics should be more aware that their church, I mean, the official view of their church on government, on politics, is not exactly the same view of the Tea Party. It's exactly the opposite, actually. It's exactly the opposite. But that is one thing that many in the church have no interest in raising, because they know that the zeitgeist, the spirit of our times, is embodied also by the Tea Party. And so they don't want to be countercultural. It makes them uncomfortable. And I understand that. But if you claim that you are there today, you should be countercultural. And they have given up on that fight, which is, I think, is decisive on how many million people are left out of healthcare and all of the consequences. I mean, it's not just an intellectual dance. It has very practical consequences.
In just one tiny, maybe, thought to bring your inspiration to another level, as you've been talking here about countercultural, in the world. I kept thinking about Thomas Merton and his own personal journey, that when he joined the Trappists, he rejected the sinful world, that he had gone to some paradisical community that, everything out there of his whole past and the whatever was, bankrupt. And in his own contemplative journey, at one point, people know about the famous Fourth and Walnut experience. He happens to be outside of the cloister, and he has this experience of these ordinary people on the street and this enormous love and identity and solidarity with them. And his shift seems to me very much what you're talking about in the shift in Vatican II, that Merton remained a critic of society, of nuclear war, of all kinds of issues that he wrote about, but it was not done out of a sense anymore of the bad world out there. It was done out of a sense of love and witness. And I wonder if that somehow is part of the spirit of Vatican II that is seen in the story of this one person.
Very much part of that. As an historian, I can see that Vatican II finally got to this point that they had to accept the world as it is, because Vatican II happens after World War II, and the cradle of Catholic culture, Europe, was the origin of the worst conflict in human history. So making that case that the Catholic world was an island of grace, isolated from the sinful others, made little sense after 1945. That's why I think that there are non-theological elements that must be considered to understand Vatican II. If we just look at the theological debates, we miss one part of this new awareness of the Church.
I want to thank you so much for your talk and for this provocative conversation. Will you join me in thanking Dr. Faggioli?